Okay, this is our third and final class. I mean, we could go on and on about this, but this will be our third and final class. We're gonna bring it all up, hopefully, to kind of the modern world right now, as far as what's going on in Israel and maybe some of the backstory having to do with that. I do have a short, like 10-minute video at the end that I'm going to show as well, multimedia presentation. Greg just got excited with it's like, you know, back in the day, Greg, you know, when we had film strips, right? You wanted to do the film strip, remember that? The film strips. All right, so let's review this slide very quickly, okay? The Jews lived throughout Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe primarily, and they were persecuted, right? As Christianity became the dominant religion, you know, the very thing that the Romans did to the Christians, once the early day Christians got power, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to do the same thing to, you know, religious minorities, particularly Jews, right? They're going to make them second-class citizens. And these ideas that were actually written in law in the Justinian Code are going to continue for centuries and centuries and centuries. You know, over 1,000 years, really. This idea of Jews being a second-class citizen. This idea of Jews being the Christ killers as well. This idea that, you know, that the Jews were responsible for anything that happened bad, right, in Europe. It was never the fault of the leaders, right, making bad decisions. It's so much easier, what? To blame the others. And this is the idea we get from a scapegoat, right, which actually is from the law of Moses. The Jews were scapegoated for all of the ills in Europe during the Middle Ages, and believe me, there were a lot. You know, particularly during the Dark Ages, with the plagues, the Black Death in the 1340s, that was the Jews' fault, right? They started the plague. They were dirty. They put poison in wells. All these types of things. All this slander of Jews is going to come out of Europe during the Middle Ages. And this, you know, we'll get to Nazism and that as we go on. So whenever things went badly, you know, the leaders in the Middle Ages, whether it's in France or the Holy Roman Empire, whatever it is, it's certainly not my fault. Definitely the Jews' fault. And this is what's going to happen. Now, during the time of the Crusades, you know, we think about the Crusades, right? We think about Pope Urban II, right, sending all of these knights. They had like too many knights in Europe. There was too much death and destruction. So they're like, let's get these guys out of here. You know what? Go over to the Middle East. They definitely need your help, right? Because pilgrims were being attacked during this time. But as the Crusaders made their way to the Holy Land, anytime they came to a Jewish settlement or a town, what did they do? They killed the Jews. Right? So the crusade wasn't just to relieve the persecution of Christians in the Holy Land. The Crusades were a time where any non-Christian was slaughtered by the Crusaders. Okay? And in fact, when the Crusaders got to Jerusalem, they slaughtered everybody, Jews and Muslims together. So this is kind of the mentality. I'm bringing this up just to show the mentality that Jews were not valued at all. Killing a Jew, you know, during the Middle Ages, you know, that's what happens, right? Second-class citizens persecuted, scapegoated for all the problems that were happening in Europe. Now, just quickly, let's take a look at Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter. And a lot of this, you know, sadly was prophesied and was written down in the law of Moses. One of the chapters in Deuteronomy. And it's a very long chapter. Okay, it is 68 verses. The majority of these verses, brothers and sisters, talk about the persecution that was going to happen to the Jewish people. Verse 65. 64, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, Neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even. And at even thou shalt say, Would God it was morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And we'll keep that in mind and just kind of go back. Verse 31. Thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof. Thine ass shall be violently taken away from before thy face, and shall not be restored to thee. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies. Verse 32. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. So, pretty strong words, pretty sad words that God is telling his people of the things that are going to happen. They're going to be scattered throughout the world. We know that. We've actually talked about that in these classes. And they were scattered throughout all of the different lands. And they were persecuted where they went because they were a peculiar people. They were different, particularly in the age of polytheism, right? Tens of thousands of God, no joke, okay, in the ancient world. And here you have the Jews with just one God, right? And we talked about this too, they were looked down as atheists, right? You guys don't believe in the gods, right? Okay. Questions, comments before we go on? All right. Wow, too many words. This really just reiterates what we said. As Christianity became the dominant religion, more and more persecution is going to happen to the Jews. Jews were not allowed to own land. They couldn't become farmers. They were banned from joining Christian guilds, right? This is a way of the apprenticeships where if you wanted to be a blacksmith, if you wanted to be a woodworker, if you wanted to work in gold, that type of thing. There was a process that you had to go through. You had in a guild. It was kind of like a union, right? Carpenters' union. And in order to be successful in the Middle Ages, you had to be part of one of these guilds. But Jews weren't allowed to do that. And so what did the Jews do? Well, they formed their own guilds, right? And this is why it was so important to ancient Jews, but also to modern-day Jews, of getting an education, right? Having schools. Because they weren't allowed to go to the Gentile schools. And so they had to really, from scratch, build up all of these different communal things that everyone else took for granted. The Jews had to build those things wherever they went. They had to build the synagogue. Part of the synagogue would be a school, not only to teach religious things, but also to teach reading, writing, and just really like a basic understanding. And so from the very beginning, the written word was very important to the Jewish people. From the very beginning, right? They had to learn to read and write in order to read the law. And this was something that was passed down through the ages. And they never forgot that. We always think about, and God talks about this in Deuteronomy, you're going to be scattered. You're going to start worshiping other gods. You're going to lose your identity. You're going to lose your culture. You're going to lose your religious beliefs, your ethnicity. You're going to do it to yourselves. And God is saying you can't do that. You have to continue. You have to keep your culture, your Jewish identity. And that was really, why there were so many prohibitions about intermarrying, about losing your cultural identity. And the Jews have been very sensitive to that because they're up from all types of different places. And this is going to play a part, obviously, in the establishment of the homeland for the Jewish people in the beginnings of Zionism, that type of thing. Okay? This is interesting. Many Jews were traders. Traders as in back and forth money, right? This was one of the few possessions to handle money. As Europe became more prosperous in the 12th century, money became an essential key to survival. Christians were banned from money lending, right? Interest. Couldn't do that, you couldn't. But Jews often were involved in the banking trade. This choice of work added to the stigma and negative stereotypes surrounding Jews, right? So this is a classic. The Christian traders couldn't ask for interest, right? They couldn't ask for interest. If I wanted to give, if Jacob needed $100, I'd just give you the $100. You wouldn't have to pay me 10%, another $10, right? $100, good luck to you. Christians couldn't charge interest, but there was no prohibition in the law for Jews to lend money at interest. So the Jewish people became the middlemen in the banks because they could charge interest. And where did that interest go? It didn't go to the Jewish people. It went to the people that were giving the money out plus interest. And so this is where one of the stereotypes of Jewish people come. Oh, they're money, money lending, right? There's a worldwide kind of banking cabal of Jewish people that is controlling the economy. It's controlling all these nations, right? Pulling the strings, right? The Rothschilds, right? One of the biggest bankers in Europe at that time were Jews. They were Jewish. They were a Jewish family. And so, obviously, when money is involved, if you lose money, guess what? Jews' fault, right? Easy to blame the Jews, particularly when it comes to financial stuff. If they're the ones that are, in their minds, charging interest. Well, they're not really charging interest, right? The guy with all the money is charging interest through the Jewish trader, right? It's actually kind of brilliant. All right. Now, this is where we get the idea of the Jewish Star of David, okay? And again, this just it wasn't like one town in France that did this, or they did this in London or something like that, or Frankfurt. No. This was a law, okay, that came directly from the Catholic Church. All right. Now, as we know, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was extremely powerful, all right? And they forced a lot of these things. Like if the church passed a certain law or a decree, you had to follow it. It wasn't just one of these things where, eventually people are going to get tired of the church, like during the time of Henry VIII, right? Henry VIII's like, I don't care. I'm doing what I want. But anyways, during this time, they were forced to wear a badge, a yellow badge, to distinguish themselves as Jews. And it wasn't just the Jews, right? The Saracens, which were they were a group of people that had moved in here from the east, okay, and they were looked at suspiciously. So you had to wear this, right? Again, second-class citizens. Do you have your badge on today? Right? They could live in certain areas, right, in these cities. This is where we get the word what? Separate area in the city. The ghetto, okay? This is the idea of the ghetto, where the Jews would live in this certain area. They couldn't live anyplace else, all right? And so this is kind of, when we think about Nazism, when we think about Germany in the 30s, right, with the rise of Hitler, these things didn't happen in a vacuum, brothers and sisters. What do you think? The Nazis were the ones that just kind of thought up all of these things? What do you think? The Nazis were the only ones that hated the Jews and wanted to kill the Jews? This is a long, long history of hatred of the Jews. Okay? The long hatred. That's what it's called. And so the Nazis, you know what the Nazis did? They just took all of this under, just below the surface, this hatred of the Jews, and they exploded it. And then they used the technology of the day, all right? The idea of the factory, right? Using modern technology. They use that to kill Jews at a massive rate, okay? 6 million of them. And they would bring them in, strip them of their clothes. They'd bring them into a room saying, we're going to give you a shower. And instead of water coming out, Zyklon B came out. And this is how they killed, and then they burned the bodies. Now, that's just one way that they killed the Jews. Do you know that when the Germans went into the Soviet Union in 1941, there was a group called the Einsatzgruppen. They were kind of retired policemen from Germany. They would follow the army, and they had one job: to kill the Jews. That was their job, to kill the Jews. and it was called the Holocaust by Bullets. In Eastern Europe and in the Ukraine, the Einsatzgruppen killed over 1 million Jews by shooting them. It got so bad that the Nazis said, hey, we've got to find a better way to do this, because it was psychologically affecting these people, killing these women and children, dumping them into mass graves. It was affecting the Nazis psychologically. So they said, we've got to find out a better way to do this. And this is where they kind of figured out. First, they wanted to kind of gas them with carbon monoxide, like, just have like a truck running and pipe it into a room, boom, that way. But this is where kind of modern technology comes in, modern pharmaceuticals, right? Zyklon B, great, we can put this in, easy. And so this was the mentality. Didn't start with the Nazis, brothers and sisters. It had been there for thousands of years. And it culminated in the Holocaust and in the atrocities that took place in World War II to the Jewish people. All right? So just keep that in mind. So, yes, Brother Jason, we got a microphone for you.
From the world, or was this done in the open? You commonly hear, when they came for the Jews, nobody cared, but then they came for me, but nobody was left, because, now we commonly see that this is done in the open, but at this time, were they hiding the fact that they were killing so many Jews, and that's why it didn't catch anybody's attention?
So it's a great question, Jason. So there's two answers to that. In 1933, when the Nazis took control of Germany, there was part of their platform was the persecution of the Jews. And so Kristallnacht, right, the night of broken glass, the Nazis and their supporters went into the different cities across Germany, destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues. That was done in the open. The German people said, yeah, I get it, we're tired of the Jews too. All right? And so this just built. Now with the Holocaust, the governments knew that the Jews were being round up. But, the Allies, like Winston Churchill, Roosevelt at that time, they had intelligence that this was happening in the Eastern Europe. But they didn't, what could they do about it? They didn't have control. So yes, it did happen in the open. There were marches by the Nazis talking about getting the Jews, that type of thing. And then it was done in the open too with the Holocaust. There were concentration camps right outside these towns. And one of the things that Eisenhower did when they were liberating some of these concentration camps, he forced the people from these German towns to go and witness what they had done, because they were denying it. Even today there's people that deny the Holocaust. Didn't happen. The Jews are exaggerating again. This is what they say. It's a sickness. You can't talk to somebody that has that deep level of hatred. You can't reason with them. So it was done in the open, Jason. Just like we see today. You're exactly right. The level of anti-Semitism in public is off the charts. I've never seen it this bad, ever. Nate.
I was actually leading to my question of all the anti-Semitic rhetoric that's going on out there. It seems like Germany is actually the most staunch against it. Like, they snuff it out immediately.
Yes.
What was the change in that paradigm from where they were in, the 40s, 30s, and 40s to where they are now?
Yeah, so I guess the easiest answer for that, Nate, is the destruction of Germany, of Nazi Germany. It destroyed it. And so what the German people did, I don't know if you remember this, but Germany was split into two sides, Western Germany, Eastern Germany, and Nazism was completely outlawed. And it took, like, the education, they totally changed their idea of education, became much more secular, and it's against the law to have Nazi beliefs now. So they are very sensitive to it. And you're right, Germany really has been one of the staunchest, allies of Israel, which is weird, right, given their history. But things change. But yeah. All right. I want to talk quickly about blood libel, because this goes hand in hand with what we were talking about in the Middle Ages. Some of the stuff that they would come up with, and this is called blood libel, was that Jews during the time of Passover would go and they would kill a young Christian child. And they would take that blood and they would put it into their matzah. And this was the Passover ritual. All right? So whenever a child died that they didn't know why, and this is what happened in this case, what did they do? They blamed the Jews. The Jews did it. They took some of the Christian blood, a young Christian child, and they took the blood and they mixed it in with their matzah, right? As part of their Passover ritual and celebration. Do you know that this is still going on today? That there's Muslims that live in different parts of the Middle East that still believe this stuff, right? And believe other things as well. And so this is part of the problem. This has been ingrained not only in the European civilization, right? It's also been ingrained, as we're going to see, in a lot of the Muslim countries as well. All right? So you're really getting it from both ends. You're getting it from the Christian communities. The Jews are also dealing with persecution in the Muslim communities as well. All right? So this idea of blood libel, when you ever hear blood libel, this is what it's talking about. The Jews are killing Christians, Christian children, stealing Christian babies, and then sacrificing the babies and taking their blood and then eating their blood in their matzah. This is what they believed. People still believe it today. All right? Okay. All right. I think we're doing good for time. Let me talk briefly about what's called the Pale of Settlements, or the pogroms. You might have heard that as well. This took place in Eastern Europe and in Russia as well, the Ukraine. This is the area. I'm going to show you a map in a little bit about where this area was. This is when Russia controlled all of Eastern, like in the 1800s up until the 1900s, up until World War I, actually. This area was where the Jews could live, okay? They were banned from living outside of this area. They were banned from going to different types of cities, all right? Hundreds of thousands of Jews lived in this area. They were second-class citizens. They couldn't leave. They were poor. They were marginalized because they couldn't access the economy at that time. And I'm not saying this area of the world was like a bustling economic region, but they weren't allowed to access any of this. So when I'm talking about poor, I'm talking about destitute. Some of these kind of, some of these towns, shatils, I think they called them, like these old, rundown Jewish towns, right? Didn't have the resources. Have you ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? Fiddler on the Roof was in this Pale of Settlements. Okay, that's where it took place, right? They're all, if I were a rich man, great, come on, it's good to him. So this is where this took place. It was, and I guess this is where the idea of Jewish community came in. I think that this is really what helped the Jews survive, was their sense of community and their sense of longing for something better, right? Isn't that what the Bible is all about? Kind of dealing with trials and tribulations and persecutions in the case of the Jews, but withstanding those things, right? The 7,000 that did not bow down to Baal nor kiss his image. Yeah, I think about that stuff, and I think there's a lot of excitation in that as well. We're certainly not being persecuted. In fact, I think the opposite is our problem. Wealth and ease, okay, fullness of bread, pride, all of those things, right? We have the opposite issue. Anyways, this is where the language, the Yiddish language, comes into play, and it's a combination of German, little bits of Russian, and Hebrew, all mixed together. All right, and so less and less people are speaking Yiddish, but I think there's about 150, 200,000 people that still speak Yiddish. And that was the primary language of Jews living in the Pale of Settlements during this time. The programs had to do with the Pale of Settlements, and this is just kind of going into Jewish homes and Jewish villages and just burning things because they're Jews, taking their possessions, okay? Second-class citizens, dirt poor, destitute. And so a lot of them tried to leave. A lot of them came to the United States. A lot of migration into the United States in the 1880s up until 1910. They had two places really that they could go to. They go to the United States or they could go to their ancient homeland, which at that time was called Palestine, okay, the area of Palestine. Brother Steve.
Question: When were these pogroms in Russia? This was during World War I, or
this
before?
was yes. So this was during before World War I. Yes. So I would say like from 1750, Steve, up until like 1910.
And how did the Jews get into Russia? They came up from Spain?
So they had moved, I'm trying to think, they had come from Spain as well, right? But they also came from just kind of different areas in Europe as they kind of spread out. And the authorities at that time pushed them into these areas.
Right.
And so a lot of them were forced into these areas as well.
So then once they were in Russia, and what did you call it, a Pale of Settlements?
Yeah, the Pale of Settlements, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
and once they were there, they couldn't leave.
Yeah, got it. Thanks,
Yeah.
Rich.
So World War I ends. A lot of them are going to flee because of the Germans, which is interesting, right? It's rather ironic that in a lot of ways the Pale of Settlements ended because of the Germans. They came in and invaded, and everyone took off like, we're out of here. And they went to what's modern-day Israel. They went to the United States during this time, okay? It is a time of mass migration of Jewish people, okay? And this is the beginnings of Zionism. Okay, so when you hear Zionism, Zionism is a homeland for the Jews. The Jewish people need their own nation. They need a place of safety, of security. We can't be beholden to these people, these leaders. We've seen what they've done to us. Everywhere where we go, we need our own nation to survive. And this was a process, a thought process first, that we needed a nation. And then when the Holocaust happened, that just emboldened the Jews. Like, we need a nation right now. All right. Here's the Pale of Settlements. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you know, this is the area. The Pale of Settlements is in green there. Main cities that were forbidden with Jews. So any of those kind of magenta squares, no Jews allowed. But we see others as well, you know, they could live there. And that's why you look at Poland, the majority, a lot of the Jews that lived in Europe lived in Poland. And so there's no coincidence that the majority of the concentration camps were found in Poland. Auschwitz is found in Poland. Okay, this is where they killed the most Jews. And it wasn't just the Germans that were killing Jews. The Poles hated the Jews as well. And they had no problem helping the Germans out to take Jewish property and then to stick them in concentration camps. Okay, it happened throughout Europe. The old hatred comes bubbling up. All right. Jews and Islam. This could be its own three talk series. But anyways, Islam really very quickly took over the Middle East. Muhammad, little backstory, Muhammad actually had allied himself with some Jewish tribes down in Saudi Arabia. So at one time, Muhammad and the Jews that were living in Saudi Arabia were tight. They worked together. Muhammad respected the Jews. They called them people of the book. They called Jews the people of the book. They called Christians people of the book. This is early on now. Okay, we're going to see that things change as they grow in power and control. They controlled the Holy Land in Jerusalem, whether it was the Arabs or the Ottoman Turks. They're going to control the Holy Land up until 1917, when General Allenby and the British forces come in and they take over. He marches into Jerusalem, right? One of the great scenes of modern history, okay? Britain now controls the Holy Land, right? You think that's great. It's not going to be great. It's going to cause more problems. Jews live under Muslim control. It's really a mixed bag, brothers and sisters, okay? There were times where the Jews and Muslims got along great. The Jews had to pay a tax, though. It's called the Dahama tax. And it was a tax that if you were a non-Muslim living in a Muslim land, you had to pay a tax, okay? You couldn't like preach or anything like that. You had to pay a tax. You were a second-class citizen. But in some cases, Jews rose to prominent positions in the Muslim world. They did, okay? So they were considered people of the book, but things are going to change, right, as Islam grows. I'll give you a couple examples, all right? This is from the Hadith, all right? This is the oral tradition of Islam. Okay, you have the Quran, which is the actual book that you read, right? The Bible, the sacred scripture, and the Hadith, which is the oral tradition of Islam, passed on by different scholars. Okay, this is one thing here. They are, speaking of the Jews, they are debased, cursed, anathemized forever by God, and so can never repent and be forgiven. Oh, okay, that's not great. They are cheats and traitors, defiant and stubborn. They kill the prophets. They are liars who falsely falsify scripture and take bribes. As infidels, they are ritually unclean, a foul odor emanating from them. Such is the image of the Jews in classic Islam, degraded and malevolent. So this idea of the odor, remember in the ancient world, the Egyptians, they told that story, that the reason why the Jews were kicked out of Egypt because they were all poor and stinky and they were defiling up the temples. Well, guess what? 2,000 years later, it's still going on. The same things are being said, okay? On the right-hand side, before 1948, you have a little chart there that tells you how many Jews were in Muslim countries, okay? Before 1948, there were a lot. There were over almost 900,000 Jews living throughout the Muslim world. Morocco had the most. You can see Iraq. Iraq had, 125,000 Jews living in it, okay, in Baghdad. And they had been living in Baghdad for over 1,000 years, okay, since the first captivity. They were living in Iraq. Think about that. In 1948, you know what happened to all these Jews? Kicked out. They kicked the Jews out. They kicked the Jews out of all of their countries because the Jews in Israel formed their own nation. They say, we are a nation right now. And when that happened, out of spite, all the Jews were kicked out of Muslim lands. And that's the way it is to this day. There is no major population of Jews living in any Muslim countries, unfortunately. Been kicked out. All right. This is an interesting one. The Day of Judgment. This is in the Quran, I think, in the cow chapter. The Day of Judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jews will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "Oh Muslims, oh Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." Okay, so this is kind of a prophecy in the Quran about there's going to be a time right before their Messiah. They're looking for a Messiah to come too, by the way, okay, called the Mahdi. All right, they're the Messiah who's going to come, okay? It's interesting. All three, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all believe in a Messiah, okay? Interesting. There's going to come a time where even nature is going to open its mouth to tell you where the Jews are to kill them. And so this one right here, brothers and sisters, has been used as a foundation as far as wars are concerned in the Middle East. In fact, some of them, I saw some on TV, some of the Palestinians were actually quoting this as one of the reasons why they went and did what they did on October 7th. Okay? So, you do have a shift from a time period very early on in the formation of Islam where the Jews and the early day Muslims got along. But for whatever reason, Muhammad said that the Jews betrayed him, that type of thing, so he kicked out the Jews and he killed one of the tribes too. And so from that time period on, there's always been a reason in the Muslim world to persecute the Jews, going all the way back, right? But what are you doing? You're imparting guilt on a whole group of people, okay? Even if you believe that the Jews somehow betrayed Muhammad or whatever, right? This happened in 600 AD, all right? 1,400 years ago. Even if you believe that, you can't impart the guilt of one tribe 1,400 years ago on a whole group of people, on millions of people. That's absurdity. But unfortunately, that's what's happening. All right. Immigration into Israel is going to increase from 1900 to 1948. Jews are going to come in and around Tel Aviv, and they're going to build that up. They're going to buy land from absentee landowners, by the way, Arab absentee landowners that were living in relatively comfort up in Lebanon. They're going to sell this land that they weren't interested in anyways, and the Jews are going to come and take it over. So that's all legal. But the Arab farmers, the peasants that were living on this land, all of a sudden, they have to go find someplace else to live and to work because the Jews now own the land, right? Even though it was sold legally, the Arab farmers there aren't going to look at it that way. They just see the Jews coming in, taking the land that they've been working on, right? And so again, this is just going to be another thing that's going to, kind of, ratchet up the hatred during this time. All right, we talked about all this stuff. This is on the right-hand side. This is a front page in 1948 in May, the New York Times, right above the fold, as they say. Okay, Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands. Okay, so there were massive riots during this time throughout the Muslim world because the Jews, Israel was created, and we already talked about that. But they were killed or kicked out during this time. Okay, brothers and sisters, we're only talking about 70, 80 years ago. Nothing, right? And this hatred has not gone away. All right? Okay. As more and more Jews came into the land, Arab violence is going to increase. There's going to be massacres of Jews in Hebron and in other places. The Jews were not innocent in this, brothers and sisters, okay? They were massacred, but the Jews gave it back to the Arabs as well. Okay? In fact, the Jews are going to form their own little kind of paramilitary organization during this time called the Haganah, and it's going to be the precursor of the IDF. But the purpose of the Haganah was to defend these Israeli settlements, these kibbutzes, right, from attacks from Arabs. Okay? Well, what happened in October 11th? Oh, the Palestinians attacked the kibbutzes, right? So it's the same thing that's happening over and over again. So what's the connection then with the modern day anti-Semitism and the Arabs and this hatred, right? We talked about that, one of the things, right? But the War of Independence is going to take place in 1948. There's a lot of different names. The Palestinians and Arabs look at this time period called the Nakba, or the catastrophe, right? This is when the Jews fought against all of the Arabs, right? It was, the Arabs wanted to drive them into the sea. That's literally what they said. But the Jews weren't driven into the sea. In fact, they actually gained some territory. The one thing that they didn't gain that they wanted, Jerusalem. And they didn't get it in the Battle of Independence. In fact, they lost thousands and thousands of men trying to relieve the Jewish quarter. They were starving to death. There was a massive famine going on in Jerusalem at that time, and they were desperate to get trucks up there. But there was only one road to go up, and the Arabs, the snipers and everything were just kind of taking out all of these trucks. 1 in 10 Israelis died in the War of Independence. 10% of the population of Israel died in the War of Independence. Okay? Astronomical. That would be like if we had a war right now in the United States, 35 million people dying. Okay? Think about that. So this wasn't just like little skirmishes. This was a fight for survival. Okay? And through God's help, some of the stories out of this, I'm going to do some classes on this maybe later on, but some of the stories that came out of this are fantastic. It's like obviously God's hand is in, helping his people, even though it was just it was a very tough war, right? Brutal war. All right. So what's the connection between Nazism and Islam? Well, on the right-hand side, we have the Mufti, okay, the leader, the religious and secular leader of Jerusalem and of Palestine at that time. Well, he's meeting with somebody. and he was meeting with Hitler. They both had Jewish problems, right? And so there was a natural affinity between the Mufti of Jerusalem and the Nazis. And in fact, the Mufti actually recruited people to go and serve in the German army. Okay, there was a Muslim SS unit. Think about that. There was a Muslim SS unit that was formed with the help of the Mufti, okay, to fight against the Jews. And he looked at it this way: they could go and get some training from the Nazis, and then they could be used. They could be brought back into the land and used against this small Jewish groups of people. And so that's the connection. So when you see a lot of the same types of slogans and propaganda that we learned about in school that the Nazis put out against the Jews, you see some of these signs that people are carrying. Israel in the trash, clean up the world, Jews in the trash, Jews control everything, the big noses, right? All this stuff. We see it on placards now. We see it on the news. It's the same type of thing that's going on that happened in 1933. And so when people say never again, referring to the Holocaust, it's happening right now. It's just that they don't have the power against the Jews that they had. In fact, Israel has a very, obviously a very strong army. And so there's no easy answers to this. But I'll just tell you this: it's untenable for Israel and for the Arabs living in this area. It can't go on like this. Something has to be done, right? I don't know if it's a two-state solution. I don't know if it's a one-state solution. Who knows? But we can't continue on like this. And I think the Israelis know that.